Welcome to the introductory video series for the Foundational Public Health Services Capacity and Cost Assessment Tool. This is video 4, Current Labor and Current Spending. This is the fourth in a series of 5 instructional videos that provide an overview of the FPHS CCA tool developed by FPHAB and the University of Minnesota. This video provides an overview of the current labor and current spending tabs of the assessment. At the end of this video, you should be able to describe the purpose of these tabs as well as their outputs, understand the needed data inputs for the tabs, be able to locate the major components within the tabs, and be able to add data into the tabs to generate the desired outputs. The Current Labor tab helps track staffing costs for the latest fiscal year. Once complete, the worksheet automatically summarizes this information by occupation category. Next is the Current Spending tab. It estimates the total resources directed to foundational public health services. Finally, all expenses are allocated to foundational capabilities or community-specific services, giving you a complete picture of how your resources are used. In order to calculate tab inputs, you will need to have several collections of data ready to input into each tab. Let's start with the Current Labor tab. Each row represents one employee. You'll need to enter their position, occupation, FTE, salary, and benefits. You'll also break down how their time is allocated across different program areas using percentage FTE allocations. Once these details are entered, the worksheet automatically aggregates the data by occupation category. Next are the inputs for the Current Spending tab. Labor costs, like labor FTE and expenditure data, autofill from the Current Labor tab. Other expenses, like direct contracts, operating expenditures, pass-throughs and transfers, or capital expenditures, are entered manually by expense type. Each expense will then be allocated across the foundational capabilities and areas, or to FPHS and community-specific services.
Let's begin our walkthrough with the Current Labor tab. At the top of this tab are totals for the data entered in the table below. These totals will be beneficial for you to verify against your department's personnel or accounting data sets. Below those totals are fields that calculate the sum of FTEs dedicated to FPHS and the percentage of that FPHS effort versus the total reported effort. In the table below, you'll be asked to enter staffing details for your department's occupations, including annual FTEs, salary, and benefits. Then, you'll be asked to distribute those FTEs across the foundational public health services and community-specific services categories. We've pre-filled some of those data, but we'll demonstrate data entry for a position. We'll use the example of a clinical supervisor, a program manager, for this example. I'll use this opportunity to demonstrate a few error flags you may be presented with when using this tool. For example, if FTE were to be entered without the corresponding occupation label, we have this flagged in order to prevent miscounting in the future. Additionally, with FTEs entered on this left side of the spreadsheet, but no allocation on the right side, you'll see a flag for percentage allocating, indicating this missingness, and also noting that there's a mismatch between what is counted for the total FTE entered versus the total FTE allocated in this example. The FPHS CCA tool also checks for unusual labor costs. If the total labor cost per FTE falls below the federal minimum wage, $15,080 in this year, or rises above the median top executive pay, $139,225 in this year, the value will be flagged for review. So for example, if an individual's total salary and benefits were, say, $15,000, that would be lower than what the minimum wage for that individual would be. And we flagged this cell to indicate that this row might need review. There might have been an error in the data entry here. Similarly, if entering in total salary and benefits and that number exceeds the $139,225, so for example, $150,000, then this value will also be flagged to indicate that perhaps an error was made and this value might be a little bit too high. Now, these are just flags. There might be reasons in which case a person's pay is below minimum wage for some reason, as an intern or student, for example. or above the 139,225 for your organization's compensation. So this flag doesn't mean that an error was made per se, but that this data might need to be reviewed. So for this position, let's say that their salary was $74,000 per year. Their benefits were $33,750. So those flags have been resolved. But we still see that the percentage allocated is 0% because we haven't allocated these FTEs across to the right. To the right, we've got all of the foundational public health services and then also the community-specific services. Continuing with the example of a clinical supervisor, let's say, for example, that this individual spent 70% of their time overseeing or caring for individuals in the department's primary care clinic, considered to be community-specific services in our model. Let's say 10% was directed toward persons with chronic disease or injury, 0.1. Then let's say an additional 25% was directed toward maternal or child health or family planning, 0.25. And then let's say remaining 35% of their time was directed toward other medical care or clinical support. Now, as a supervisor and someone working within the leadership and management team, this individual would likely spend some of their time doing foundational public health services work or things to support infrastructure or population-based services. Let's say 5% of their time was spent overseeing community activities to reduce barriers to accessing clinical care. So 0.05 there. We'll say 10% of their time was spent supporting communicable disease prevention and control, such as immunization planning or supporting the prevention of communicable disease. So 0.1 there. Let's say also that this individual provided a certain amount of time supporting the performance management system related to their activities or healthcare activities as well. So 0.05. Last but not least, as a member of the leadership or management team, let's say that 10% of their time was spent participating in departmental leadership meetings and other managerial functions, so 0.1. So if we look to the left, this individual's time has been fully allocated. So we see the 1 FTE here, 100%. We have no flags present here, and all of the staff within this tab have been fully allocated. Let's direct our attention to the FPHS FTE and percent FPHS in the middle. In this example, a total of 31.25 FTE were entered for this department, of which 18.05 FTE, or 58%, were considered directed toward foundational public health services activities. This might not be the case for your department. You might find that more than 60% of your effort was dedicated toward FPHS. This is flagged in our tool because many health departments do struggle with delivering the full suite of foundational public health services and deliver a high proportion of community-specific services. If you see a flag adjacent to the percent FPHS cell, it does not necessarily mean that an error was made. We only request that you please review the data that were entered to make sure that your foundational public health services, your population-based services and infrastructure are kept separate from the individual clinical transactional services found within the community-specific services. Next, let's focus on the current spending tab. This tab works very similarly to the current labor tab, but is dedicated to expenditures. First, labor data flows in automatically from the current labor worksheet that we just reviewed. This shading indicates that these data were pre-populated from a prior tab of the tool. There's also entry for other departmental expenditures like direct contracts, other operating expenditures, pass-throughs and transfers, capital expenditures, and then we also have a feedback field at the bottom. As you enter data, the FPHS CCA tool might flag certain cells. For example, this indicates that there is a higher than typical proportion of spending dedicated toward the foundational public health services. Though this might make sense. For example, in these other operating expenditures, many of these are core operating expenditures through the organizational competencies like utilities, telephone, other services that are cross-cutting and necessary for the health department to operate. So in this example, this flag is something that can be disregarded for this health department. Similarly, for these direct contracts, the services that are being delivered are for foundational services that are being rendered, such as support with communicable disease control, chronic disease and injury prevention, and other contractual activities. As with the current labor tab, data are entered into the total cost side after entering what the contract category is or the other expenditure category is. Then that spending needs to be allocated across to make sure that 100% of it is allocated. In these examples, the data were entered such that the total contract expenditures were distributed across the services where they were provided. For example, for the City of River contract, we can presume that for this, the City of River was contracted with to support population health, communicable disease control, population health, chronic disease and injury prevention. Things such as public campaigns or communications or other widespread community engagement, and other activities to support these population-based services, or in these instances, surveillance and organizational competencies infrastructure through this grant consultancy. The last note that we'll make for this tab is that under each of these contract categories, we have flags available for if these data do not match what was entered into the background tab where these expenditures were entered. Presently, the amount entered into the background tab for direct contracts equals the amount that was entered into this tab for direct contracts total. But if this number is different for any way, say for example, in putting in a certain amount of money, a flag will be present to indicate that the amount entered into this section does not match the amount entered into the background tab. This will be important for your review and verification of the data that were entered into this tool.
As mentioned, this is the fourth of 5 videos in this instructional series. If you require assistance with material that is beyond the scope of these videos, we invite you to visit FPHAB's assessment website, and you can also reach out to FPHAB or the Center for Public Health Systems at the University of Minnesota via email.